Thank you, David, and thank you, Moshe and Mohammed, for your very erudite remarks. I'm going to be very American and physician-like and use some slides. I hope that everyone is able to see these now. I have a title for the moments that I have with you that is "The Syringe Belongs in the Hand of a Physician, Power, Authority, Control, and Euthanasia." I'll start with this gentleman, Victor Brock, who was the administrator of the Nazi medical euthanasia program, which preceded the concentration camps. This program killed large numbers of psychiatrically and developmentally ill Germans way before the concentration camps began. It's called T4 for Tiergartenstrasse 4, the street on which the headquarters was located. And Brock's was the administrator, and his motto was "The syringe belongs in the hand of a physician." Euthanasia was, as David suggested, sometimes literally done by an intracardiac injection of phenol by a physician, but it was more often done by gas. It was usually actually done by others, but always medically supervised. And in this sense, metaphorically at least, the syringe was always in the hand of the physician. It's an evocative phrase, sounds very plausible. I find it in some ways sort of chilling when we talk about it in relationship to euthanasia. And so I want to explore a little bit about what it might have meant then and what it might mean for us today. I want to explore with you really in some ways the form of thinking that permitted physicians in Nazi Germany to conduct the T4 program and to go beyond that. And it begins with the idea that really is deep in Western culture over the last few centuries. With the advent of modern science, maybe we can trace it to Bacon, the idea that knowledge is power, that medicine more and more gained knowledge that was very powerful. If you read a book like Bacon's The History of Life and Death, medicine's power was thought to be to stave off death, and that doctors would control bodies through the power of their scientific knowledge. That may seem strange to you, but if you think about it, this, I think, is the way we think today about medicine, whether we're patients or physicians. The objective of the patient is now also to control the body, their own body. And the way it works is that they authorize the physician to use the power of medical knowledge to control their bodies. So it's now a joint undertaking in control of the body that's in some ways the heart of the way we think, although not always consciously, about medicine. And if you don't believe me, this is the way drug companies know how to market medicines to doctors. This is an advertisement for warfarin, the brand name Coumadin. It will give you mastery, which is the ultimate expression of yourself. Now, an instructive way to think about this today, I think, comes from Martin Heidegger. If you'll forgive me, the irony notwithstanding that a Nazi sympathizer could be used in a talk to criticize Nazi thinking, but he was a good philosopher. And particularly his very famous essay, The Question Concerning Technology, I think can be instructive for us. In that essay, he distinguished between an older form of technology that he called poiesis, in which, if we apply it to medicine, we could think about the doctor as calling forth the body's own healing capacities. So the way a Hippocratic doctor worked was to adjust the humors in the body to call forth the healing potential that was already within the body. And this was the way, Heidegger says, most previous technologies before the modern era worked. But the new forms of technology that began perhaps even in the late 18th century, certainly by the late 19th century, and strongly by the beginning of the 20th century, were of a different sort, in which the doctor, we would say, if we apply this to medicine, commands the body, bending it to the joint will of the patient and the physician. And Heidegger talks about the way in which we are embedded in a way of thinking, what he called a Gestell, or in framing, in which we implicitly assume that this is the way things work. The body, for many of us, has now come to be considered what Heidegger suggested all of the earth had become for the modern technological mind, manipulable stuff. And we've introduced a new kind of dualism in which the patient has become a kind of disembodied source of preferences, owning and commanding that body with the doctor. And we are all embedded in this kind of way of thinking about medicine and about ourselves and our own bodies. Now, German medicine before the Nazis was also in many ways at the forefront of this Gestell. The Germans in the early 20th centuries were the models of scientific medicine. Think of names like Virchow in pathology, Koch in terms of bacteriology and infectious diseases. They were the progressives of the world in terms of medicine. People went from the United States and the UK to Germany to learn medicine at its peak. They were the leaders in genetics, leaders in eugenics. They began by the mid or the 30s to think that they had actually, though fallen behind, taught the Americans and the British too well, and they were falling behind in terms of, for instance, things like sterilization of quote unquote genetically defective individuals. So they were already in many ways embodied in, embedded in the technomedical Gestell. Introduced to this, then Nazi medical philosophy. And there were ways in which Hitler wrote about and thought about medicine, and it was part of the philosophy of Nazism, that they began to emphasize prevention over the care of the sick. Vorsorgen over Fürsorgen. And the world's first textbook of medical ethics was actually written by a Nazi physician. The Nazis were the first country in the world to require medical ethics, if you want to put scare quotes around that, teaching in medical schools. Ärztliche Rechts- und Standeskunde, der Arzt als Gesundheitsseher, the physician as a health guide or coach or leader. The emphasis on in Nazi medicine was on prevention and on population medicine, something that ought to make us a little nervous, perhaps with our move in that way, to control not of just the body of the individual patient, but the control of populations of patients. Jay Lifton has suggested that National Socialism was nothing else but politics as applied biology or a biocracy. There were more physicians who joined the Nazi Party than any other profession in Germany. They were at the forefront of Nazism because it gave these ideas that they had had for years before the Nazis of eugenics and this technomedical Gestell, a way of making it the realm's way of thinking. And Germany then shot to the forefront of eugenic sterilizations. They were praised for this in publications like the Journal of the American Medical Association. And the upshot of this is important take-home message for everyone, is that Hitler did not impose a eugenic and racist agenda on medicine. What he did rather was to empower physicians to carry out their own long-standing prior agenda. He gave them control over patients' bodies, but also began to empower them in terms of social policy as well. And here's what Ramm says in his textbook on euthanasia. It is the task of the physician to be pioneering in regard to these ideas. It is the task of the state to give it the force of law. Medicine leads. All the Nazis do is give them the chance to take it to its extremes, most extreme measures. How does this get instantiated? I'll give you another example of a Nazi physician, Imfried Eberl, was a psychiatrist who joined the Nazi Party as a medical student, went on to become an SS member and the medical director of the T4 euthanasia program, again, for psychiatrically ill patients and developmentally disabled patients at a place called Bernburg, sort of southwest of Berlin. Now, this is a picture of the gas chamber in Bernburg. Bernburg, I can tell you, is still an active psychiatric hospital. It never stopped being an active psychiatric hospital. This is in the basement, and upstairs they are prescribing Prozac. Now, I've been to Auschwitz, I've been to Birkenau, I've been to Theresienstadt, I've been to Sachsenhausen, but nothing was more chilling for me as a physician than to see a gas chamber in a hospital, particularly one that is still actively treating patients. This is where the gas chambers began. Physicians were euthanizing larger numbers of patients than they could do by individual injection, using initially carbon monoxide in gas chambers in hospitals. And here's the connection between medicine and the final solution. You've got to put yourself into the weird strangeness of Nazi thinking. They thought they were wasting ammunition by shooting Jews out in the East. The soldiers were actually getting squeamish about shooting large numbers of unarmed non-combatants. And this presented a problem for them. So they began to question, who knows how to kill large numbers of people quietly? The answer? Physicians. They know how to do it. They've already been doing it in the T4 program. And so Imfried Eberl was sent from Bernburg to create the first gas chamber in Treblinka. Again, Hitler did not invent the gas chambers. Physicians invented gas chambers. Now, what does this have to do with medicine today? Certainly, that's a chilling story that I just told you. But we share the Baconian dream of forestalling death. As I said before, I think control of the body has become our central theme. And we are embedded in the techno-medical gestalt. The body for us is still enframed as standing reserved to be controlled. Now, what happens, if that's the way you think, when you face the limit of control, when you experience finitude, which is at root an experience of suffering? Well, what cannot be controlled makes no sense when the only sense that can be made is to be in control. And what cannot be controlled in this totalizing schema then becomes senseless suffering, and it is intolerable, unacceptable, or unbearable. And what happens then is that what cannot be controlled must therefore be eliminated. What cannot be controlled must be eliminated because it is unacceptable to think we cannot be in control. The central issue then and now in assisted suicide and euthanasia is control. It's not autonomy. If you ask patients in surveys, and David alluded to this, why did you autonomously choose physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia? The answer is loss of independence, loss of control, the helplessness of waiting for death, dependence upon others. It's loss of control. It's not intractable symptoms that leads patients to move towards assisted suicide or euthanasia, because that lack of control is judged to be intolerable. Physicians come at it from the same perspective. It is very difficult for them to accept the limits of medicine when they cannot control every aspect of the patient's suffering. A quote from a survey, it's an awful thing to come to the patient with your bag of tricks empty. And this lack of control for us as physicians in the technomedical gestalt, which is all about control, also becomes intolerable. What are the problems that this introduces? Well, if autonomy is not the issue, it isn't, because it's whether it's authorized by a deity or the state or the patient, the issue is control. Even autonomy gets subverted by the technomedical gestalt. Patients, I think, merely internalize the worthlessness that the doctors and the rest of us see in them and play it back to us as what seems to be an autonomous request. And we even try to measure the subjective suffering of the patient, which seems to me to be quite bizarre, making it objective somehow. Second, the control that is being fostered here is actually illusory, right? Death still wins. If it seems intolerable that we can't control death, I'm going to kill you instead. That's a little bit ironic, I think. The dualism that is introduced by this technomedical gestalt is also false. There is no ghostly person separate from and controlling the body. We are embodied persons. Good medicine must in fact accept limits and be humble. As Hippocrates put it, when the patient is overmastered by disease, desist because medicine is powerless. So allowing patients to die is perfectly compatible with that form of medicine. It accepts the limits and steps back. But assisted suicide and euthanasia represent a refusal to accept those limits, a refusal to accept that we cannot control what is in fact uncontrollable. And the looming danger, the real looming danger, is the marriage of totalizing medicine and the totalitarian state. Because both are fixed on control and both strive to eliminate what cannot be controlled, right? The totalitarian state takes the dissident and puts them in jail or executes them, right? It's the population that must be controlled. For medicine, it's the individual body. Marry those two together and we're in real trouble. That's what happened in Nazi Germany. And the chances of putting those two things together are not so remote, not so remote. It is possible, I hope it is, for us to see this clearly enough to be able to practice humble medicine, mindful of our limits, through things like palliative care, promote acceptance by patients of the idea that some aspects are beyond control, help them to find sources of self-worth other than control, and eliminate their symptoms, but not eliminate them. I think it's possible for us to reject the dualism that's implicit in this technomedical gestalt, which we think our own bodies are just stuff to be manipulated instead of just being us. And I think we can seek a proper relationship between profession, state, market, and academy so that a wise physician will not seek the power of the death-dealing syringe or the prescribing pen, and a wise society will not place it in the physician's hand. But we ought never believe that medicine is incapable of doing this again. I think the story of Nazi medicine is a call to remain vigilant and be careful. So thank you.